Warm welcome to our speaker this evening, Bishop Wright. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation and coming to our college this evening. My name is Shahriar Ashrafkhorasani. I'm a student at Brookes studying theology in the second year, and I'm running this project through Student Union. I'm very grateful that the Students Union has sponsored this project. Especially a very big thank you to Robin McSorley, the Deputy Chief Executive of the Union, for his unwavering support. At the end of the events, we all go to the Students Union bar, so please do come and join us for complimentary wine or fruit juice if you prefer. It is important to come, even for a couple of minutes, because we want to, it's good for this open discussion society, to grow, so to get to know each other. So it would be very good if you could come to the Students' Union Hall. And before you leave, please make sure you have written your name and email address here, which I will give it to you. Maybe you can pass it down from here, yes. And I'm very delighted to have the very Reverend Bob Wilkes here, former Dean of Birmingham Cathedral, with us, who will be introducing the speaker this evening. During 1990s, Bob Wilkes was a regional director for the Church Mission Society in the Middle East and Central Asia. He is currently the Oxford City Rector and the Vicar of Parish Church of St. Michael at the North Gate, with the Saxon Tower, which is the oldest tower in Oxford probably, and the tallest one. So Bob Wilkes.
I'm very honoured to be known as the vicar where there's a Saxon tower. You can climb it, by the way. Come and visit. I had Shahriar and Muhammad with me on placement in the summer. Iran kind of took over the church. Muhammad is there with the camera, and you're just keen that the folk are relaxed. And so, if you would rather not be photographed tonight, I don't know how you're going to do that, Muhammad.
Just raise your hand.
Yes, somebody's. He wants to take general shots at the event. Okay. Bishop Tom Wright is known for a lot of things, but I want to tell you the most important thing. He is no mean guitarist. I think we were student friends, and one thing we did is we put on a concert together, didn't we, all kinds of things, and you've got your guitar out. So we've known each other a wee bit, and in the Church of England he's been a dean at Lichfield, he's been a bishop in Durham, he's worked at Westminster Abbey, he's done lots of Church of England things, and he's done lots of Anglican things too, helping. As you know, there's sometimes pretty difficult relationships across the Anglican communion, and we're very grateful. But I guess the way a lot of people know Bishop Tom is as a writer. I remember a previous Archbishop of Canterbury some years ago, Michael Ramsey, addressing some students, and somebody asked him, Archbishop, what would be your recommendation for the reading of the theological students in the Church of England? And the Archbishop stood up and said, you should read big books. Bishop Tom writes big books. He also writes smaller ones. He writes quite a range, and people appreciate him because he's a great scholar of the New Testament and of Paul he's now, but also is able to write in a way that the general reader, who hasn't got specialist theological background, can really benefit. And so we're very grateful. And on his theme tonight, I appreciated this book by him called Surprised by Hope. And I just got the kind of message, about 2 pages in, I think, Tom, that you had a feeling that Christian people, in fact maybe people in general, hadn't quite got it. And you wanted us to get it. So we're looking forward to you tonight to helping us do that.
Thank you.
Bishop Tom Wright. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you, Shahriar, for setting all this up, and thank you all for being here. It's a great joy to be with you. I confess I wasn't quite sure what sort of size composition of audience this would be, and I'm very happy to see several old friends here as well as lots of new ones. And I certainly hadn't expected Bob to be doing the introduction. I think if I'd known that was going to happen, I would have been emailing him saying, please don't say this, please don't say that. Fortunately, he hasn't said any of the things I might have worried about. Although the concert that he and I set up together as a kind of Christian folk concert was more or less the direct means whereby I met my wife. So, because she was singing with somebody else, and I had a song that needed a girl's voice, and she came and sang it with me, and the rest is family history. So, thanks, Bob, for your part in that. Sorry she's not here tonight. I've been asked to speak on this theme of what we say about either life after death, or, as I have said frequently, life after death. When I say that, it seems quite clear to me what I mean. I can see some puzzled looks already around the room, and that's the normal reaction. So if you're puzzled by that phrase, life after death, it isn't just a misprint, where in my text I've got too many life afters in there. It actually is making a very important statement about something that many, many Christians routinely forget, if they have ever known. This is, perhaps by coincidence or providence, I don't know, a very good week to be thinking about this, because November the 1st in the church's calendar is All Saints' Day, and has been All Saints' Day for a very, very long time. However, November the 2nd, in more recent times, i.e. merely the last few hundred years, is All Souls' Day, and some bits of the church, particularly the Roman Catholic Church and some bits of my own church, regularly now commemorate All Souls' Day as a different sort of event from All Saints' Day, and this then gets into a total muddle, because of course the day before All Saints' Day is our old friend Halloween, and I see in the shops around Oxford, of course, Halloween is being commemorated, celebrated. I'm not sure what you do with it, but anyway, all sorts of funny traditions, some of them, I'm sorry to say, from America, have crept into our culture recently. And this illustrates the fact that our society as a whole, and within that the church often, sometimes actually as a whole, really doesn't quite know what to say about what we're supposed to believe about what happens after death. And as a clergyman, I've taken my share of funerals, perhaps not quite as many as the average parish priest, because in the odd jobs I've done, you don't get quite so many to do. But you always find people saying, what I want to know is, where is he now? Or where is she now? And will we see them again? And all of that. And these are hugely urgent, important, pressing pastoral questions. And often, church people and people in wider society fall back on platitudes of, oh, well, yes, we just have to trust we'll meet again one day, etc. But without any real deep sense of engagement either with the Christian tradition or with the New Testament, or actually with some of the great writings on this theme. And so what we've had over the last maybe 200 or 300 years in the Western Church particularly has been a sort of a slide. If you go back to the 15th century, the 16th century, often then you still have a robust belief in resurrection. And then over the last 200 years particularly, this has rather dwindled, often so that the word resurrection is simply used as a metaphor for life after death, and people assume that life after death means going to heaven. And some people still insist that it's an either-or, heaven or hell. Others take a universalistic option. But the idea that at death you go wherever you're going, if there is any going to be done, that is what most people now just take for granted. And there are all sorts of oddities that then creep in. I remember I was Dean of Lichfield at the time when Princess Diana was killed in that horrible car crash in Paris. And the next week we had books of condolence in the cathedral for people to sign. Actually, we didn't think in leafy Lichfield in the Midlands that too many people would come. The first day we started off with one book of condolence, and by noon that day we had 6 books on the go, with a queue snaking all the way around the cathedral for people to come and sign their condolences. And reading what they wrote was very revealing. God didn't have enough angels in heaven, so he called you to be one of them as well. Or, this evening I will look up and there'll be a new star in the sky and I'll know that that's you. All sorts of things like that. reading these, I found myself thinking, did people intend this metaphorically? What did they actually think was going on with that? It just wasn't always clear, but there's a sort of vague sense which actually, as a classicist, Bob and I both read classics here in Oxford, as a classicist, this kind of thing was widespread in the ancient world. People believed in astral immortality, people believed in different kinds of theories about what might happen to you after death. Some people, of course, in the ancient world, like many people in the modern world, think that when you die, that's it, finish, all over. There's a little slogan, an acronym, which appears on a lot of ancient tombstones, NF, F, NS, NC, which stands for, in Latin, non fui, fui, non sum, non curo, which means, as of course most of you will know, I was not, I was, I am not, I don't care. In other words, yeah, once upon a time I wasn't, then I was, and now I'm not, and so what? You know? And that's the attitude that in the ancient world, as in the modern, a lot of people have to death. But then people who live within the Christian tradition, or people who are on the edge of the Christian tradition and think they know what Christians ought to believe about it, assume that today that Christians believe in life after death, in going to heaven, whatever. And then you come back to the New Testament and you come back to this week with Halloween, All Saints and All Souls. We say, what on earth is all this about? The problem with All Saints and All Souls is it makes a great division. And this corresponds to a medieval theory in which the saints are the special ones who've actually made it. They really are in heaven already, but there are lots of other people, sort of ordinary Christians, ordinary folk, who are in some holding pattern, some intermediate, not very pleasant place in Catholic teaching purgatory, although some recent Catholic theologians have been cleaning that up a bit, including the previous Pope Benedict. That's another story. Ask me about that afterwards. There'll be time for questions. So I'm throwing lots of ideas out, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, do feel free to ask later. So that you've got the saints, the great ones, you know, Peter, Paul and Mary and company, who've all made it, and then you've got the souls, and people often say, well, those are our own recently dear departed, and so we have to pray for them, and it's all rather gloomy and dark, and people decorate the church with sort of black frontals and so on to show that they're not in a very good place, and we hope that one day they will be. And this has become extremely muddled. Happily, on All Saints' Day, if you go to church on All Saints' Day, or any time around now, you may find people singing one of the great hymns, which is the hymn For All the Saints. That's a hymn which actually, in my view, gets it right, and I'll tell you about the hymn in order then to lead into what I think is at the heart of genuinely New Testament grounded Christian belief in what happens after death. According to the hymn, the golden evening brightens in the west, soon, soon to faithful warriors cometh rest, sweet is the calm of paradise the blessed. Alleluia. That's saying those who we have loved and see no more, those who have belonged to Jesus in this life, they are in a place which we will loosely call paradise, for want of any better language. I'll explain that later. But then the next verse says, but lo, there breaks a yet more glorious day. The saints triumphant rise in bright array. The King of glory passes on his way. Alleluia. In other words, paradise is a place of blissful rest after the work of this life, but that's not the end. I've often said, and in America this gets a laugh, you probably won't hear, that heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world. In other words, yes, paradise, fine, as a holding pattern, but then there is a new world. What the New Testament promises us is not that we leave earth behind and go to a place called heaven forever and ever and ever, but God will make new heavens and a new earth, and they will be joined together and they will be one and the same place. And that's actually what Jesus taught his followers to pray when he said, pray, thy kingdom come on earth as in heaven. He didn't teach us to pray, thy kingdom come in heaven as in heaven. No, heaven and earth are to be joined together in one. And that is the great promise which most Christians I find in the Western world have never even heard, let alone begun to get their heads around. But it is that promise, of course, which then is given solidity by the resurrection of Jesus himself. The resurrection of Jesus 3 days after he was crucified is, of course, unbelievable, because we know, just as they knew, that dead people don't rise. I was once on a television program with a skeptical German scholar discussing Easter and all that, and he said rather angrily, we know that the body, I can't do the accent, but we know that the body of Jesus has moulded in the tomb. I remember he saying, moulded in the tomb. And I said, how do you actually know that? He said, I have 200 years of scientific historiography on my side. I said, 200 years? You know, Socrates knew that the dead don't rise. Homer knew that. Pliny knew that. You don't need to have modern science with Newton or Darwin or anybody else to tell you the blindingly obvious fact that dead people don't rise. This doesn't happen. The Christian belief is not that the resurrection of Jesus was just a very odd event within the old world the way it was. The Christian belief is that when Jesus of Nazareth came out of the tomb on Easter morning, this was the beginning of God's new creation. This was the beginning of a whole new creation in which the resurrection is not an odd event that you somehow have to swallow. It is the paradigmatic, central, foundational event. And it is scary because it isn't a foundational event about a new world taking place somewhere else. It's about a new world transforming this present world. And that's, of course, what the ministry of Jesus was all about. He went about telling people, this is what it looks like when God becomes king. And he went about feeding the hungry and healing the sick, and including and welcoming people of all sorts and shapes and sizes and backgrounds. That, he said, is what it looks like when God is starting to become king on earth as in heaven. And so then, after his death, when he rose again, his disciples, who were jolly well not expecting this event, he had tried to tell them, but they seemed to have thought that he was simply using a fancy metaphor. It must mean something odd, we don't quite understand what. Then when it happened, they were first incredulous, and then they gradually began to realize this was where the great story of Israel had been leading all along. All those old stories about Exodus and about return from exile, this was where it was all going, and it's actually now happened. And one of the extraordinary things about early Christianity is that they very quickly revised and reshaped, did the early Christians, what they themselves believed about life after death. Now, as I say, people have a lot of funny beliefs about life after death. They did in the first century, they do now. But when people do funerals, it tends to be a moment for tradition. When something really sad has happened, you reach back for the things that you know, the things that were done when you were young, the way they buried people in times that you remember, etc. You do the same stuff, you say the same things. That's often how it is. What we find with the early Christians is that though most of them came from non-Jewish backgrounds with all sorts of funny ideas from their backgrounds about what death meant, etc., and though quite a few of them, and certainly the early ones, were Jews with very specific Jewish ideas, the early Christian belief about what happened after death was radically reshaped around their belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead. And so we find them articulating right through the New Testament and on into the 2nd century and beyond this belief that when God's people die, they go into this, if you like, this holding pattern, call it paradise. Jesus says to the brigand who is dying next to him on the next adjacent cross in Luke 23, today you will be with me in paradise. And note, today is Good Friday when Jesus is dying, but Luke tells us very quickly afterwards in the next chapter that 3 days later Jesus rose again from the dead. Paradise, an ancient Persian word meaning a lovely, beautiful garden. Paradise is a metaphorical way of saying that when you die, if you belong to Jesus, you will be in this blissful place of rest, Paul says at one point, my desire is to depart and be with the Messiah, which is far better. But that's not the end of the thing. Remember that hymn, lo, there breaks a yet more glorious day. The saints triumphant rise in bright array. This wonderful sense that one day God is going to make new heavens and new earth, and he will raise from the dead all those who belong to the Messiah in order to share in the running of that new world. And that, I think, is a hope that most people simply haven't got their heads around. And that's why I call it life after death. Life after death, paradise. I had a very poignant moment in my own life 2.5 years ago. My own father died, not unexpectedly. He was 91, he'd been failing for some while. But I was due to fly the next day to New York and to do a presentation to a Christian Philosophers Society on what Christians might believe on the basis of the New Testament about the soul, life after death, and so on. I said, I can't do this. I've got to help organise the funeral. My family said, no, Dad would have wanted you to do this. Get on the plane, go and do it, and come back and we'll do the funeral in 5 or 6 days' time. So that's what I did. So when I was doing this lecture, I was thinking very sharply about my own father, who had read, bless him, all my books. He wasn't a theologian, he was a businessman. When he read my big book on the resurrection, all 700 pages of it, he phoned me up 3 days after he got it. He said, I finished it. And I said, what? 700? He said, I started after breakfast the first morning, and I've just gone right through and I finished. He said, I tell you what, I really started to enjoy it after about page 600. One of those nice backhanded compliments that parents can pay their children. That's another story as to why he thought that. Anyway, but I was thinking about my father and thinking, what do I say about my father? And at his funeral, my brother actually preached, but I led the service. And how do we say these prayers? And what we found ourselves doing was entrusting him to the sure mercy of God, to the loving presence of Jesus, from right this moment onwards. But then we celebrate the hope that one day when God makes his new world, then he, my father, makes it very personal for me, and all of us will be raised from the dead to share in that new world. Because, as Christians, like Jews, we believe in God, the Creator, and God who will put all things right at the last. The doctrine of creation and the doctrine of what Christians call judgment, that's not negative judgment, it's God sorting stuff out once and for all. Creation plus judgment equals resurrection. It's more or less mathematical. If God is the creator, but he's never going to sort it all out, then what a shame, never mind. Entropy rules, okay, the world is just going to dissolve sooner or later. If God is the judge who will sort it out, but doesn't care about creation, then his sorting out might mean that we all end up sitting in some platonic heaven, disembodied, no creatureliness anymore, in a different mode entirely. But if God is the creator who made a good world, and if he is committed to sorting it all out at the end, then we have to believe in new heavens and new earth and in resurrection. And so we can see right across the early Christian movement, they believed in this and they practiced it. It actually made sense for them to be people of new creation. And so the early Christians developed this in passages like, we see it in Paul, our earliest Christian writer, 1 Corinthians 15. He talks about the present age as the time when Jesus is already ruling the world as Messiah, but the way he rules the world is not the way that people would expect. Paul picks up exactly what Jesus was saying in the Gospels, where Jesus was going about saying, this is what it looks like when God becomes king. And you know, today people say, if there is a God, why doesn't he stop evil happening? Why doesn't he stop genocide? Why doesn't he do this or that or the other? And often in our world, when people are thinking like that, they think, well, if I was God, I'd send in the tanks and sort this lot out. You know, I wouldn't let evil have its way like that. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us what it looks like when God is being king. Because those Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, the poor in spirit, the pure in heart, the hungry for justice people, these are not just the people who are going to be blessed when God becomes king. They are the people through whom God intends to bless the world. When God wants to rule the world, he doesn't send in the tanks, he sends in the meek and the merciful and the mourners and the hungry for justice people. And by the time the bullies and the bad guys have woken up to what's going on, the meek and the mourners and the hungry for justice people have fed the poor and have clothed the naked and have housed the homeless and have built schools and hospitals and have transformed the world. And my friends, we are all captive to the ideology of the Enlightenment, which has told us that Christianity is part of the problem, not part of the solution. But actually, as a historian, I want to say, yes, the church has got 1,000 things badly wrong, but actually, God has used people like those people that Jesus was describing to transform the world beyond recognition, so that it can be, and in many places is, a place where you will find hope. Signs in the present of the new creation which God wants to do in the future. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the ultimate stage when God will be all in all, and that we already are glimpsing that and working for it. And in Romans 8, a spectacular passage, he talks about the whole present creation groaning in travail, like a woman going into labour, so that the new world will be born out of the womb of the old. And that we who believe this are caught up in those labour pains, so that in our suffering, in our difficulties, and in our prayer, we are actually, even though it doesn't usually feel like that, taking part in the birth pangs of God's new age. And then in the glorious scene at the end of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22, we have this picture of the New Jerusalem. And now here's the funny thing. I went to a performance some years ago in London, I think it was at either Covent Garden or one of those opera houses, of a staged performance of Verdi's Requiem. We happened to know one of the soloists through a contact we'd had, and so we got tickets and so on. And it was brilliantly done. I mean, it's wonderful music, and to see it with a sort of quasi-operatic staging was brilliant. But one of the key scenes, when they were saying, Liberame Domine de morte aeterna, save me, O God, from eternal death, the chorus were all given candles, and they all made their way up staircases on one side and the other side of the stage, until they were all upstairs singing beautifully with their candles. I was sitting there thinking, that's magnificent, but it's not what the Bible says about God's ultimate new world. The last scene in the Bible is not about people going upstairs to a distant place called heaven. It is about the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth. And again, most Christians don't even know that that's what the Bible says. And most non-Christians don't even know that that's what Christians are supposed to believe. It's about heaven and earth coming together into one, into a place of joy and justice, into a place where all the Creator's intentions for his world are finally fulfilled. You know, at the beginning of the Bible, you have this garden, which is an image of God actually bringing beauty out of ugliness and order out of chaos. And the humans are tasked with creating community and making it all work. The trouble is, when they rebel, they make communities which are themselves dangerous and hostile and arrogant places. So that at the end of the first great bit of the Bible, you have the Tower of Babel, human arrogance vaunting itself against God. And God has to start a rescue operation with a nomad, Abraham, a wandering man with no place to call his own. And somehow the end of it is that God is going to make a city which is also a garden which is also a city. So that that great antithesis in our modern world between the urban blight and the kind of rural escape is going to be reconciled at last. This is what the Bible is all about, the bringing together of the